So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Department of Public Seminar. I'm Ian Thompson. I lead the Pedagogy, Learning and Knowledge theme group, and it's our turn to host, and we're really delighted that we've got a great speaker tonight. So Ian is one of the rising stars of linguistics, as you'll see from not just his great academic publications, new one coming out in Oxford Review of Education imminently, or just published, I think.
Just assigned to an issue.
Just published, but also from his media profile. So Ian's going to be talking on the white ears of Ofsted. He's going to talk about 45 minutes. He's a senior lecturer in critical applied linguistics, emphasis on the critical, I think, at Manchester Metropolitan University. He does a really interesting range of research, particularly looking at deficit language thinking in schools and the way that it's seen by both sometimes the professionals working in schools, but also the inspectorate coming to look at it. He works closely with teachers, and he's involved in a range of projects which all do with the future of linguistic justice. I would like to mention a couple of awards that Ian has got for his 2022 monograph, which standards stigma surveillance racial linguistic ideology in England schools. That's a long title, Ian, but it won the British Association Applied Linguistics Book Prize. He was also a recipient of the 2023 Outstanding Contribution Research Award from the National Association for the Teaching of English. He's an editor of critical studies in education. So we're really looking forward to this. Ian will speak for about 45 minutes. Thank you very much, Ian, for coming.
Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks very much. Thank you. Cool, nice introduction. Thanks, I appreciate it. And thanks for the invite. It's nice to see lots of people that I recognise here. So hello. Hopefully get to catch up with everybody afterwards. So yeah, I think I won't mess about actually, and just get straight into it. And I wanted to start by just describing a little bit of a story about why I became interested in Ofsted. And it's a picture of me about 1992. I was always interested in language and literacy and reading, right? And yeah, I've got a really long relationship with Ofsted and what I now, I suppose, call linguistic injustice, although I've not always called it that. And my first experience really of Ofsted was when my state comprehensive school just in the north of England, northwest of England, was burnt down metaphorically by Ofsted after they gave the school its lowest rating. They said that the school was unsatisfactory, whatever language they used at the time. And then following that, in the weeks after, it was burnt down by arson by people in the school who felt disenfranchised, felt that school wasn't a place for them. And I've always blamed really Ofsted for that. As a child, and then later as a teacher, I was a secondary teacher for about 7 years or so. My kind of strongest memories of school are really where like linguistic injustice was quite normalised. So the kind of everyday ridiculing of accents, people who spoke properly were given kind of celebratory praise. I remember I had a South Asian teacher who experienced the racist mockery of her voice, not just by students, but by other teachers as well. And when I was a teacher, I remember a black Caribbean colleague of mine had an Ofsted inspector tell him that he should seek out accent training. So when I moved from teaching and started as an academic, Ofsted has always been quite a central theme in the work that I do, that's really been kind of motivated by prior experiences ever since I was a little kid. And I continue to see those ideologies of linguistic deficit underpin Ofsted's work, underpin educational research that they increasingly draw on in their work, and indeed in school inspection reports that I'll talk about quite a lot today. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour then, like I've tried to put in as many examples as I can in today's talk. Like I always think a nice like rhetorical strategy when you're doing this kind of work is what's called like sledgehammer with receipts, right? Like drive home the message, but just kind of chuck all the receipts in there, lots of examples. So I'll give us as many examples as I can to just try and really illustrate just how embedded what we can call linguistic injustice is into the work of the inspectorate. So here's an example from a school in Moss Side, Manchester, just around the corner, really, from where I live and work right now. A school with a predominantly Black Caribbean population in a very area of economic deprivation. This comes from their Ofsted rating, Ofsted report, where the school is badged to be requires improvement. And notice here how the children's lack of ability, or purported lack of ability, to speak in standard English is being kind of ideologically associated with their intellectual ability, even though those two things are obviously not related whatsoever. And here's another example for some recently leaked training materials for Ofsted inspectors that were published in 2020, where what they say is that the ability to use standard English is an instrument of social justice. So the acquisition and the framing of standard English is a kind of core tool in social justice struggles and thus tackling inequality. So those two examples just begin to illustrate some of the core arguments that I'll put forward today and that runs throughout my work. And those are really that Ofsted increasingly, and really have a very long time, drawn on very flawed ideas about language itself, and that's coupled with very flawed ideas about social justice itself as well. So the title of this talk then is The White Ears of Ofsted, and that title comes from a paper that me and my amazing colleague at the University of Leeds, Julia Snell, and I published a few years ago. And I thought I would just outline a little bit about what we mean and what we describe and what we meant by the white ears of Ofsted. So by the white ears of Ofsted then, in that article, we refer to Ofsted as a technology of sonic surveillance. So this is not about individual sets of white biological ears at all. We're not interested in the individual listening practices of individual inspectors. I know that we've got some people from Ofsted in the room. But what we are interested in is institutional modes of perception and structural modes of perception that are shaped by power, by whiteness, and by the fact that around 90 to 92% of Ofsted inspectors identify as white. So Ofsted are an institution that's marked by its whiteness. We're not interested in a critique of individual inspectors at all. I think that isn't the argument that we're putting forward. But we're interested in how the policing of language is something that's historically and structurally embedded as a design feature into the inspectorate, and how those very oppressive ideas about language are simply part of its organisational architecture. So our work is focusing on language, but that really takes place in dialogue with a bunch of other brilliant work, which is increasingly exposing Ofsted's powerful influence in schools and teacher education programs in a number of different ways. Lots of recent work that I'll point you towards that's pointed out Ofsted's culture of fear, of toxicity, of humiliation, of what recent work calls the clipboard police, its deficit stances on marginalised communities and what they do with language and culture more broadly, and of course its role in teacher suicide in the recent case of Ruth Perry a couple of years ago, when Ofsted were named on the coroner's report for a head teacher who took her own life. So whilst Ofsted claims then that equality and diversity and inclusion are at the very core and at the very heart of their work, we're interested in this question, well, how does it hear language as part of this? So to critique the white ears of Ofsted then, we take what's called a ratio-linguistic perspective. And a ratio-linguistic perspective is simply a tool of analysis. It's a perspective that explores the very long and very colonial histories of how race and language get co-constructed over time and how they get institutionalized, especially in places like schools, but also how we might contest those ideologies. Key to a ratio-linguistic perspective then is where we place our attention. So for years, the attention has been on the allegedly deficient language of marginalised communities. A ratio-linguistic perspective relocates the problem away from those communities and what they allegedly cannot do with their language, and towards how they are perceived and how they are heard, i.e. the white ears of Ofsted. Rosa and Flores then call this the white listening subject. And like our perspective on Ofsted, we're not interested in kind of nefarious, prejudiced white individuals, but modes of institutionalized judgments which are built on the logics of white supremacy. A ratiolinguistic perspective then really tells us and reminds us that categories like standard English and correct grammar, etc., are not these objective and empirical things that simply exist out there in the world, but they're tools to uphold white hegemony, and they are ratiolinguistic ideologies which frame racially marginalized communities as linguistically deficient, impure, and deviant, regardless of what they do with their language. Finally, a ratiolinguistic perspective rejects a theory of change that puts pressure on marginalized individuals to modify themselves, and instead pushes for the abolition and the redesign of entire systems. So at its core then is a transformative and abolitionist theory of change, which we'll later see how that might apply to Ofsted. So before we get into details about Ofsted's current practice, I think it's really important to kind of not give Ofsted too much credit, right? They certainly didn't invent deficit ideologies about language, although they are certainly really powerful in reproducing them. So deficit thinking about race and language has a really long history. It's got its roots in European colonialism and the framing of indigenous languages as kind of subhuman, as simple, as animal-like forms of communication. Through the 1960s, lots of you will of course know Bernard Coard's work, who along with Black community activists and parent groups exposed how Black Caribbean children in England's schools were systematically perceived as linguistically and intellectually inferior when they were placed into so-called schools for the educationally subnormal. And in post-2010 especially, educational reforms, of course, of which Ofsted are a central part of, really bolstered a resurgence of deficit thinking about language. And as part of that deficit thinking, teachers became increasingly positioned to remediate alleged deficiencies on behalf of the state. Ofsted then simply represent one part of that long history and one part of that long genealogy. Ofsted have long reproduced ideologies about language which are durable and stubborn and very, very difficult to shift. But if we look at the past, we can think about how to critique the present, and then we can possibly better address possibilities for reparative futures. So how might we go about inspecting the white ears then? Or to put it differently, how does Ofsted hear? So as some of the work that me and my colleague Julia did then to investigate how Ofsted do this, we carried out a number of different procedures. So first of all, we visited the National Archives in Kew, which holds inspection reports from about 1839 to 2000. And we collected hundreds of historical school inspection reports. We then built a digital corpus of around 100,000 contemporary reports that were published in a 22-year period. And across that corpus that we built, we were able to examine how language ideologies surface. So by doing searches for things like speak clearly, standard English, correct grammar, academic register, etc., we were able to see how those ideas and discourses about language surface across different inspection reports. We were then able to examine the relationship between the presence of those ideas and ideologies about language with the racial and the class profiles of schools to see how Ofsted play a role in what we call the maintenance of white linguistic supremacy in terms of the language ideologies that it reproduces. If that all sounds a little bit too complex, maybe, then here's a much more straightforward research question. So a couple of months after we published some of our first findings in Language and Society, the Times Educational Supplement picked up on some of that work and went with the headline, "Does Ofsted have a problem with language policing?" Maybe that's the research question that we should have used. I don't want to give any spoilers away in answering that question. I think you can probably allude to the answer of what that question is. But again, just to try and show you some examples about how we're coming to the conclusions that Ofsted do indeed have a problem with language policing. So here's an extract from a school inspection report from 2019. So where the adults, so the teachers here are being framed as having spoken standard English grammar, as making too many errors in their standard English when they teach, as modelling bad habits, as teaching incorrect grammar, and that when they do teach, what they need to do more of is intervene and correct and remediate the allegedly deficient language of children's language use. They need to do more to correct pupils' poor language or vocabulary. So does Ofsted have a problem with language policing? Yeah, I think it definitely does. Definitely reminded us of some of the more historical data that we looked at. We were quite shocked when we saw things like this, but we could have indeed pulled from hundreds or indeed not thousands of examples in the work that we published. So looking back at some of that archival material then to really make the argument that deficit thinking about language and class and indeed race was really a foundational design feature of the inspectorate from its conception in the mid-1800s, as people like Linda Muggleston have pointed out, and that many children, even back then, were written off due to those alleged linguistic deficiencies. So from a school report from 1867, Ofsted saying that many children are illiterate in regards to how they talk, that they have concerns that children cannot articulate correctly, that the less able children have particular weakness in speaking and proper articulation. Notice again that there's that ideological connection between an alleged ability to speak properly and your intellectual ability, that the speech of many children is of insufficient worth, and that teachers again need to do more to cultivate what they call pleasing intonation and clear speech. So we could have shown you hundreds of examples here. I'm just kind of showing these just to demonstrate the kind of ideas about language which we found in some of that archival material. Put simply then, to kind of just tie together aspects of the argument so far, we frame the inspectorate as something that's long been a core mechanism, not just in the construction of the ideal learner, as people like Deborah Udall point out, but what we call the ideal speaker, i.e. to be an ideal speaker in the classroom, whether that be a child or a teacher, you have to demonstrate complicity and have to exhibit complicity with so-called standard English or related ideas of correct grammar, etc. Those ideologies are not race neutral, they're not politically neutral, but they're forged along the lines of both class and race. And those ideologies very much persist right into the present. So I'll show you some examples then from some of the more contemporary reports that we looked at as part of the corpus work that we gathered. I've organised these into three themes, so I'll show you three themes on this slide here. And the key point really in showing you some of these examples is really to kind of highlight the density of the language policing that we found in the data. So all of these examples comes from schools with very racially diverse school communities. That data is available as part of the Ofsted inspection reports, and most of them exist in areas of economic deprivation. So what we have here is ideas about language. There's seats at the front if you want to grab one. Ideas about language which are never just about language, and indeed sometimes they're never even about language at all. So first of all, we found a very, very core theme, that ideas about the Ofsted police the language of children under discourses of derision and deficiency. So in 2014, Ofsted saying that these kids have poor speaking skills, a limited vocabulary, weak grammar, and difficulties with articulation. That some students struggle to answer things in full sentences. They often revert to grunts, phrases, one-word gestures, one-word answers or gestures, and that their speaking skills are restricted by what they call the poor command of standard English, and that most kids have very poor language skills. So Ofsted inspectors hearing these children from the starting point of linguistic deficit. Related to that, the Ofsted inspectors reproduced the idea that non-dominant or non-standard forms have no place in the classroom, that they should be erased, that they should be eradicated. So from 2005, the idea that children are employing the words like thingy and what's it in the gaps of words that they would like to use but don't know or can't remember, and that they're mimicking speech patterns that are full of slang and colloquialisms, as if that's the only way to talk. And some pupils are writing in non-standard grammar, and that those errors are not addressed by teachers, and so the errors recur. And finally, the idea that we have the co-construction of linguistic and intellectual ability. So put simply, the idea that Ofsted inspectors hear standardised English as a sign of academic capacity, and they hear non-standard English as a sign of intellectual inferiority. So the more able pupils being told that they're speaking standard English with sound pronunciation, that higher attaining pupils have a good standard of English and are very articulate, and that the majority of pupils' language doesn't conform to standard English, and that as a result of that, pupils don't have the language to move into an imagined world. They don't have the language to support their creative ideas, purely because they have this alleged inability to produce standard English. It wasn't just children who we found that had their language policed as part of the inspectorate's work, but teachers as well. So Ofsted approves schools and teachers that dish out punitive and very hostile language policing. So in some inspection reports that were graded to be very good or very outstanding, Ofsted were highlighting things like this, where teachers were insisting that students were answering questions using what they call correct grammar and incomplete sentences, that students are challenged to speak and write accurately, that the school is doing a good job in eradicating the use of like by students. That's a hugely successful focus, according to Ofsted. And that, I don't know how many times I've said like already when I've talked, but and that pupils signal when others speak ungrammatically, that pupils are policing the language of each other, and that should be praised as part of the school's practice. That teachers get positioned to be these kind of standard language role models and remediators, that they model standard English, that they're helping pupils to enunciate correctly, that they readily correct incorrect use of English, and they paraphrase standard English when pupils lapse or slip into the local dialect, as if it's some kind of mistake to be fixed. And similarly to the idea of how children get policed, the idea that teachers' pedagogical ability gets co-constructed with alleged linguistic ability. So whereas some adults have weak spoken standard English grammar, and too many staff are making errors in the way that they speak, meaning that in some cases, this means that they are modelling bad habits or teaching incorrect grammar. Whereas in the best lessons, teachers were referencing the need for standard English, and students were provided of this with a list of banned words to remind them that was kind of sellotaped along the classroom wall. Those of you who work on teacher education programmes may well have experienced the sonic surveillance of the white ears of Ofsted. I'll just show you one example here. So this is from Bradford College. So this is a college which trains pre-service teachers predominantly of South Asian heritage. This is from a report from 2017, but Ofsted were criticising lecturers on the programme, criticising them for not insisting on the correct use of English, and also criticising pre-service teachers on their alleged inability to use standard English when they speak and when they're teaching students whilst on placement. So how do Ofsted hear the non-dominant and non-standard language patterns then? Well, they hear them that they're somehow symptomatic of low educational standards. They hear them as signs of bad behaviour from children, as poor discipline, as some kind of intellectual deficiency, as sloppiness and laziness more broadly. They hear them as signs of poor quality teaching, and they hear them as signs as poor attitudes to learning. So non-dominant language patterns get perceived as these imagined signs of educational failure, which as a result require punishment, remediation, and purification. But of course, there's no empirical relationship between somebody's ability to produce standard spoken English and their ability to teach well, behave well, or be engaged in school, but there is a very long-lasting and very stubborn ideological relationship. And crucially, those ideologies were very historically embedded into Ofsted, with racialised students living in poverty particularly likely to be targets of Ofsted's hostile and punitive language policing. These ideologies then extend into the lives of young teachers. So in some work that I published a couple of years ago in the British Journal of Sociology of Education, I did workshops and interviews with 26 racially marginalised pre-service teachers, talking to them about their experiences of language policing and language oppression whilst in university and also whilst on school placement. And what we found in that work is that racially marginalised pre-service teachers' alleged inability to speak properly and speak well got heard by mentors and by Ofsted inspectors as these imagined signs of pedagogical inferiority, whilst crucially, when white teachers spoke in non-dominant and non-standard ways, using local dialects and local vernacular, that was heard as signs of coolness, as relatability, and pedagogical quality. Ratio-linguistic ideologies tell us that no matter what racialized speakers do with their language, they will always be heard as linguistically deficient, even when they switch to standard English. Teachers got instructed by managers and mentors to modify their voices because of this perceived and persistent threat of how Ofsted hear and then how Ofsted punish. So here's Shanika, a black teacher in the study, who's talking about her experiences of being warned by her mentor. And she said to me, I was warned that if Ofsted ever came to visit, then her accent would be something that she'd have to work on, she'd have to modify and change, because they said that that was something that the school got pulled upon on the last time that they were inspected. They knew that Ofsted were coming and they knew what Ofsted were listening for. Aditi, a South Asian teacher, said that my accent was something that the school were worried about. They had these concerns about it. And in one school meeting, they were all given these kind of sheets about things to get ready for Ofsted for, one of those kind of crib sheets. And one of those was about speaking properly. And in my next mentor meeting, she was like, Aditi, this definitely applies to you. So those experiences of language policing led in some cases to new teachers that were in the study questioning their career choices, wondering whether school was the right place for them, and in some cases deciding not to continue as a career in teaching at all. So I would argue then, at a time of teacher recruitment crisis, ratio-linguistic borders keep out and indeed push out those teachers that were deemed to be in breach of idealised linguistic whiteness, regardless of what they did with their language. So Ofsted's linguistic injustice then is not a mistake, it's institutionalised. So despite their claims that equality and diversity are at the core of their work, me and Julia reject that. And we say that racialised students living in poverty are particularly likely to be targets of hostile language policing. Those are not by any means individual errors, but they're symptomatic of broader institutional and intersectional discrimination, which is designed into and indeed embedded into the very core, into the very heart of the inspectorate's ideologies and policies. When we've taken some of this work to Ofsted inspectors then, and on social media and in some of the press coverage that we've had about the work, there's been a little bit of pushback from Ofsted about that work, where they've said, well, yeah, you know, we recognise that this is problematic, but it's really about a series of individual mistakes that individual inspectors are making. We would argue against that, and we would push back against that. And we would say that Ofsted's discriminatory policing of language is by no means a mistake that is simply the product of individual inspectors, but it's something that's woven into its very fabric. It's something that is by design. I think that point can be proved when leaked confidential training materials released a couple of years ago exposed, sorry for sharing them. If anyone wants them, actually, they're really interesting. I'm quite happy to share them. Exposed how inspectors are actively trained to listen out for linguistic deficiencies, i.e. they're being told to do so in inspector training. They're being told to punish non-compliance with dominant language ideologies, and they're being told to reproduce language as assimilation logics, which see the acquisition of standard English as some vehicle for social justice. So here's some extracts from some of those training materials, where a good school is one that has high expectations, where teachers speak standardized English with pupils. A good school is one where teachers should be appropriately correcting pupils' grammar when they're speaking, that good teaching is that which takes place with the modelling and the insisting on the correct academic register, whatever that is. That a non-aspirational culture among staff is exhibited in the non-standard language that they use. And if pupils can't speak grammatically correct language, then they get excluded from mainstream society. And by those logics, teaching things like standard English and teaching children to speak standard English is a matter of social justice. So that moves me on then to the second part of this critique then, which is not so much about the flawed ideas about language which underpin Ofsted, but about the flawed theories of social justice which underpin its work. So we can think about theories of linguistic justice and language and social justice then existing on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, assimilationist and accommodationist-based theories of change really locate the problem within individuals, and therefore the result of those logics is to achieve social justice. We need to change those individual language practices to fit in with dominant patterns. So a very kind of socially reproductive theory of change, right? Evolution is kind of still prioritizing dominant language codes, but this time we might build in some more critical awareness about language and power, but at the same time, the logics really of that remain intact. And then finally, on the other end of the scale is what might be called transformation and abolition. And transformation and abolition, of course, are less focused on the modification of individuals within a system, but they're much more focused on dismantling and redesigning entire systems from the ground up. So if we zoom out and we think about where Ofsted locate the root cause of social injustice, then we can see that Ofsted are right about here on the spectrum, because Ofsted consistently locate the problem within individuals, and by those logics, they locate the solution in the modification and the remediation of those individuals. But of course, all that does is refocus and deflect attention away from unjust systems. Let me give you some more examples, just to try and prove the point a little bit more. So Sean Harford, back in 2020, said that pupils are disadvantaged by not being able to speak standard English, and rejected ideas that standard English is a means of perpetuating class hierarchies, that it is now, according to who, I don't know, widely regarded as an instrument of social justice. If this is quite making sense, here's a little meme that I generated just to kind of, if anyone's not quite getting this, right? The Ofsted's kind of undue focus on standard English and unrelated linguistic categories simply deflects attention away from unjust systems and right into marginalized individuals. To give you some more examples, Sarah Hubbard, who was the English subject lead, I think, until recently, said that standard English is correct English. It's the English that enables you to become an active citizen. Reminded me of what Keir Starmer's been saying recently about learning English, right? Amanda Spielman, the ex-director of Ofsted until recently, talking about these children. She's talking about children living in poverty here. They arrive at school without the right kind of language. They arrive at school without any language. They face disadvantage not because of systemic inequality, but because of their alleged inability to use the right kind of language. And Matthew Purves, the Ofsted's director of schools, says that this is about equity. It's about social justice. And the most disadvantaged children are those who don't have access to the fewest number of words. So reproducing a deficit and long-standing deficit logic about language, class, and race. So what we have here then is Ofsted reproducing this idea that marginalized communities and their language practices are persistently framed in terms of what they allegedly lack. Ofsted are reproducing a deficit framing about language, and those alleged defects get located as the root cause of injustice. And therefore, by those logics, fixing them gets framed as a solution for undoing inequitable schools and indeed wider society. I would argue then that those theories of linguistic justice are deeply flawed, appealing as they might be to policymakers, but they're also very mainstream. So those mainstream theories of linguistic justice frame the acquisition of so-called better language and more language as this kind of reference point for social progress, social equality, and social justice. We can see these logics appear in textbooks, very popular textbooks for teachers. So Alex Quigley's Closing the Vocabulary Gap, a piece of research that Ofsted increasingly draw on, says, well, there are thousands of small solutions to the damaging inequalities that we observe in our society, and they can be found in the English dictionary. Like, I really like dictionaries, right? But I'm not sure that they're the answer to social injustices. in the logics that Ofsted reproduce. What those logics do reproduce then is an interpretation of structural inequality, that it's a linguistic problem which requires linguistic solutions, rather than a socio-political problem which requires socio-political problems. As a result of those logics, unjust structures are left intact and overlooked. Those logics often surface under very benevolent, very kind of altruistic, very philanthropic guises, sending marginalized communities the message that, yeah, the modification of my own language is somehow in my own interest. It becomes a viable means to undo oppression and so-called disadvantage. Ofsted's vision of social justice then simply deflects attention away from itself and indeed wider systems of injustice and upholds the ratio-linguistic status quo. And increasingly, in the last few years, not just under a guise of benevolence, under a guise of philanthropy, but under a guise of what Ofsted brand as research. So those ideologies of linguistic deficit increasingly appear under guises of scientific objectivity and hard research. For example, in Ofsted's so-called research reviews, which signified Ofsted going under a rebranding of itself towards a research institution. So in their research review series for English, here's what Ofsted wrote about standard English. They said, well, that's the register and the vocabulary of social talk that pupils engage with at home. That's different to the academic or formal register and vocabulary that's used in classrooms. And as a result of that, narrowing what they call the word gap between pupils who are word rich and word poor is vital. So note what Ofsted are doing here in reproducing very dichotomous framings between home and school and what they call the word rich and the word poor. And as a result of those dichotomous framings, some language practices get framed as unsuitable for school and thus categorize some children as requiring remediation through the filling of gaps, the filling of holes, and the filling of absences. As we know then, inspectors get actively trained to identify and intervene on those alleged deficiencies and absences. I noted Heather Fern, who was one of the architects of the research review series, tweeted recently about them, and Amanda Spielman replied and said, yeah, the subject reviews and reports made an excellent foundation for subject-specific inspector training, which is essential to proper inspection. So again, I think this underscores my argument that what we have here is not a series of mistakes in terms of deficit thinking about language in the inspectorate, but something that's intentional and that it is woven into its very architecture. So I would argue then that those logics are flawed, and all that they do is preserve and leave intact systems of oppression. So theories of change then which focus on the remediation and the modification of the linguistic behaviours of children leave unaddressed the systemic and structural barriers that those communities are confronted with, as well, of course, as overlooking decades of very rich ethnographic work which has repeatedly highlighted the linguistic dexterity and creativity of such communities. Marginalised communities then, regardless of what they do with their language, face stigmatisation and exclusion, even when their language might seem to correspond to standardised norms. And of course, as Audre Lorde told us all those years ago, simply acquiring dominant language codes will not undo broader systems of oppression. But what they do is reproduce language as assimilation logics, which deceptively reinforce logics of white supremacy by placing demands and pressure on marginalised communities to modify themselves. Those flawed logics of linguistic justice are simply just one part of its broader architectures of power, of control, of fear, and of surveillance that reaches into schools. Language oppression as part of Ofsted is normalised, it's by design, and it's intergenerational. So how might we make sense of this then? Previous theorizations of language policing then tend to think of it as kind of something that's very explicit, that's very immediate, that's very observable, that's very audible, that is something that surfaces in kind of individual immediate moments of hostile correction. I'm not suggesting that form of language policing doesn't take place, but I would argue that that is by no means the default mode. Language policing instead is something that's a little bit more hidden. It's something that's woven into the very design of Ofsted in how ideologies of linguistic correctness and hierarchies influence curricula, policies, assessments, research reviews, etc. The problem is, then, if we frame language policing as something that's about individual acts of violence, then that leads us to theories of change which focus on changing individual inspector behaviours through things like training, rather than challenging inequitable systems. Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence, then, a theory of violence that emerges really from environmental injustices and climate injustices, captures the ways that geographical violence and injustice and inequality is something that's produced gradually, that's something that exists out of time, that's hidden, that's often very mundane, that's something that becomes routine through intergenerational oppression. I would argue that language policing has been at the very core of almost 200 years of school inspection. There's been ebbs and flows of that, without a doubt, but that often unfolds in very hidden, but certainly very persistent ways. If we think about language policing as something that's to do with slow violence, then it brings attention to the affective dimensions and the felt, embodied feelings of linguistic injustice, and indeed how it over time etches itself into people's very bodies. So to illustrate that, then, I'll go back to the article where I worked with some racially marginalised pre-service teachers. And one of the teachers in that study was Derek, a black pre-service teacher, one of the teachers who questioned his kind of place in school, who questioned whether teaching was the right career for him. And that questioning was on the way that his language got often perceived. And he talked about that in terms of a feeling, something that was kind of not quite there. He couldn't quite name it at times, but he said that since starting to teach, I've always had that feeling that my voice is out of place. It doesn't kind of sound right for school, right? I would get these disapproving looks from others whenever he slipped into his East London accent. No one kind of ever said anything, but it was just this kind of feeling that he couldn't quite name, but it was something that was persistently there. So he never experienced a kind of explicit form of language policing, but what he was experiencing was language policing as slow violence, and this idea that the way he spoke positioned himself as an outsider, as someone who simply didn't belong. So I always get asked when I talk about Ofsted, well, have you tried to talk to them? Like, have they listened? And I'll just end the talk by just recounting some of the work that me and Julia have done to try and engage with Ofsted. So for a couple of years, we tried. I feel so naive, like telling this story now, right? Because me and Julia really started off some of that work with hope. We raised our concerns. We had 3 private meetings with Ofsted. We offered suggestions for change for free, right? We were offering our labour for free. Here's some of my meeting notes from 2021, where we had a meeting with Ofsted's National Lead for English. In that meeting, we were invited to send up to 5 research papers of our own and of other people's work. But we were kind of preempted with this warning that, well, they wouldn't be included in Ofsted's research review if they didn't align with the general view of Ofsted. So it's like, okay, well, not the best place to start with. And me and Julia had prepared very meticulously for that meeting. We kind of went into it with very good faith. And at the time, I would argue that we really believed that Ofsted were kind of capable of progressive reform, but we left with a feeling of being deeply insulted and deeply patronised. A couple of years later, we met with the English subject lead, who really doubled down on this idea that the production of standard English is a central effort in social mobility and social justice, despite us showing evidence to counter that. We produced this 1-page summary of our work, but we never got a thanks, we never got a reply. I think it's ironic then that Ofsted have recently engaged in what they've called the big listen. Whereas really what me and Julia would say is that, well, actually Ofsted has an institutional inability to listen, or at least listen in certain ways. We ended this piece in Forum, which is a really nice special issue about Ofsted and educational injustice, where we recounted some of our feelings about reform and later on about abolition. And we wrote that if Ofsted inspectors were to have training on linguistic diversity, then that's fine, but it's certainly not the solution to the injustices that it produces, right? Any kind of training about linguistic diversity or about linguistic diversity and racial discrimination, for example, is simply not going to be sufficient. When we have something like language discrimination, which is a foundational feature of an institution, any anti-discrimination efforts require systemic transformations rather than simple modest tweaks and alterations in the form of training. And as we wrote this at the time, Martin Oliver has just been announced as Ofsted's next chief inspector. Well, given that Oliver was one of the commissioners on the Sewell report, a document that I'm sure you're all aware of, that attempted to deny the existence of institutional racism, we have very little confidence that Ofsted's future activities will take seriously our concerns and indeed related concerns. How might we move then towards linguistic justice? And what role, if any, do Ofsted have to play in that? Well, first of all, any theory of linguistic justice would really begin with the stance that linguistically marginalised children will always be linguistically marginalised as long as their lives are marginalised more broadly, right? Ideas about language are never just about language. We would argue that linguistic justice is, yes, concerned with building critical knowledge about language in order to challenge deficit thinking, like some of the examples that I've showed you today. But it's also about making connections between linguistic stigmatization and broader patterns of privilege and discrimination, which Ofsted seem to be missing. And finally, it's about contributing to broader social justice efforts, not by looking for tweaks or fixes to an inherently unjust system, but about pushing for radical transformative change of what are inherently unjust systems. So think back to that spectrum that I showed you earlier then about linguistic justice. We would argue that abolition is the only way forward for Ofsted if they have any role to play in linguistic justice. We know that linguistic injustice is not about individual prejudices. It's not about individual inspectors holding some kind of bias. And so any attempt to educate individual minds is simply going to leave bigger systems intact and unaddressed. An abolitionist theory of change as applied to Ofsted begins from the starting point that unjust systems are not broken. They're working exactly as they were designed to do so. And so no amount of tweaking will fix them. I'm quoting from Arati's amazing book here, who says that tinkering at the edges, that piecemeal interventions are locating either blame or responsibility within individuals, such as teachers and students, are merely insufficient. They actively entrench education's complicities in racial violence. Arati, you put it so much better than I think I could ever do so. Applied to Ofsted then, and linguistic injustice, abolitionist theories of change instead give us a long-term, creative and hopeful project which focus on the dismantling of oppressive ideologies and new forms of schooling and education from the ground up. And in some speculative fiction work and some speculative exercises that me and Julia did with teachers for linguistic justice, all of those speculative work, Ofsted had no role to play. The teachers chose to abolish Ofsted as part of those speculative visions for what linguistically just schooling might look like. So I'm 1 minute over time, so I'm going to leave you with some headlines on here, and I'll just run through them really, really quickly. First of all, just to say that this work is just simply building on and is in dialogue within a bunch of other related work, which is pushing for the exposing of the systemic injustice within Ofsted and pushing for its abolition and transformation rather than simple, modest reforms and tweaks. I would argue that if we think of Ofsted's language policing as a form of slow violence rather than individual moments of correction, that's a productive way of thinking because it pushes us to think about the systemic nature of linguistic discrimination within Ofsted, and it also pushes us to think about how schools get primed to listen out for perceived deficiencies because of what they think and know that Ofsted are looking for. The Ofsted shift to repositioning itself as a research institution simply serves to propagate ideologies of linguistic deficit, but under new narratives, this time under narratives of scientific objectivity and benevolence. And if we start turning attention away from the allegedly deficient language practices of stigmatized speakers and towards the way that people listen, then we might be able to have a productive conversation. And that Ofsted are simply one way in which deficit thinking has always been propagated in schools, but it's always been resisted. So the work of Bernard Coard, for example, in the 1970s, pushes us to engage in social justice efforts which are concerned with the transformation of unjust systems in the pursuit of linguistic injustice. And the final quote that I'll leave you with is this from me and Julia, that just summarises some of our thinking about Ofsted. That says, since its establishment in the 1800s, we argue that Ofsted and the inspectorate must be understood as what we call state-sponsored language police. So their work has normalised ideologies about language in schools, where concepts like standard English and related ideas are heard as the exclusively legitimate code, and that those ideologies are particularly marked in schools serving racialised speakers who live in areas of economic deprivation. Thanks so much for listening and inviting me. Thanks to Julia, of course, who's my kind of long-term friend and collaborator, but also to the amazing teachers that we collaborate with, and some of those teachers who are doing amazing things to imagine and kind of think beyond current conditions that they're currently faced with, including the work that they do with Ofsted. Thank you so much.